The essential foundations for reading and spelling success. When we talk about the foundations of how we teach reading, we're talking about methodology, we're talking about approach, not necessarily specific curriculums. So there are thousands of different curriculums that teach reading and spelling, and they come from different approaches. So we're not going to talk about specific curriculums tonight. I really want to talk about approaches that are most effective and what the characteristics of those approaches are. So, here are three key components that we want to consider when we're thinking about an effective reading program. First of all, we want to use a model that seeks to understand how the brain learns to read. And this idea is based on some really interesting work done by Marianne Wolf. She's a reading researcher. And one of the things that she has pointed out is that reading is not an innate skill in human development. Spoken language is an innate skill. You don't have to teach a baby how to speak. They just naturally pick up that skill from their environment, from their experience of the world. But reading is different. Reading is an acquired skill. Why is that? Because reading essentially the art of written language, reading and spelling, is applying an artificial code to spoken language. So the spoken language is natural, but in order for us to record it, to write it down, we had to create a code in order to do that. That code is the alphabet. So we take a spoken word and we turn it into letters. Those letters represent the sounds of the spoken word, and those symbols, those letters, are able to represent the spoken word. That's not innate to human development. In fact, it's actually a relatively new process in human development that didn't come about until civilization, until human beings stopped being hunters and gatherers and nomads traveling all over, and they started to have agriculture and settle in one place and have villages, and now all of a sudden have a need to record, document different kinds of things. And so that's really a product of civilization. It's a latecomer to human and brain development. And so brains are naturally wired for language, oral language, but that not all brains are really well wired for written language. And that's why we see some disconnects. So we want to think about a reading approach that understands the brain component, how the reading brain works. Secondly, we want to consider programs that use an interdisciplinary approach derived from multiple fields. If you spend any time in education or academics, you might recognize that we tend to be very siloed in our specialties. And a lot of times, different specialties don't really do a good job of collaborating with other specialties and sharing information. Education and psychology are a great example of this in some respects because in education, we use certain terms for learning disabilities, and in psychology, we use different terms for learning disabilities sometimes. And so sometimes we even have different language for the same thing. But the most important aspect here is that we have a lot to learn from multiple disciplines when it comes to developing an effective reading program. So we want an approach that considers that interdisciplinary connection. And finally, we want to use an evidence based, research validated instructional method. This seems to be very obvious, and for most of us, we think this should go without saying. But so many of the reading programs that are popularly used in a lot of large scale school curriculums are not the most evidence based and research driven. They don't have the best data behind them in terms of efficacy. And we'll talk a little bit about that as we dig in a little deeper. So those are some essential components that we want to consider. One of the most important and I think valuable contributions to reading methodology in the last probably 10 years or so is something called the science of reading, or SOR. And this is an approach that really checks that third box for us. It gives us very much an interdisciplinary approach to reading instruction. So, science of reading draws principles from cognitive psychology, which has to do with behavior, communication science, which has to do with that oral language component that's natural to us, developmental psychology, which considers what's developmentally appropriate for different ages and their stages of brain development. It draws from education and implementation science. So, how do we teach these concepts in a classroom? From linguistics, which also has to do with the principles of language, from neuroscience, how the brain itself works, and from school psychology, which has to do with that social emotional development in a school setting. So, science of reading, that approach draws from all of these. If you're looking for sort of a high level guideline for whether this reading curriculum is a good choice, consider whether or not it aligns with the principles of the science of reading. Another name for this approach that you'll sometimes see is structured literacy. So, a structured literacy versus a balanced literacy approach. When we're using a appropriate reading methodology, we want to consider these things. One thing that has been popular recently in reading is the idea of balanced literacy. Balanced literacy essentially says that there are many different ways to teach learners how to read, and that if we can somehow present all of those ways, then learners of different learning styles will pick up on different ones. So that has been a very popular approach for a long time in reading education. But really, the science of reading research that has happened most recently has debunked that theory. Sometimes I think of that as the throw the spaghetti at the wall and see what sticks approach to reading. And we're going to look, if we look at these principles, we're going to see why this is not the most effective way. It turns out there actually is a best way to teach 95% of learners how to read. A great majority of learners benefit from one specific methodology. And sometimes we say that if we um, apply the right approach to reading instruction, we can make poor readers good readers, and we can make good readers great readers. So there really is a best way to teach reading. And the best way encompasses these things. It has to be evidence-based. We've already covered that the research really helps guide our decisions. It needs to be multisensory. What do I mean by multisensory? We access the world through sensory input. That's how we take in information about the world around us. And so when we're thinking about just the human experience, we have sight, we have hearing, we have smell, we have touch, we have taste, all ways that we take in sensory information. When we're thinking about academic learning, we actually think of four spheres of sensory input. We think of visual input, so things that we see, auditory input, things that we hear, tactile input, things that we can touch or feel, and kinesthetic input, which is the movement component. So, visual, auditory, tactile, and kinesthetic. When we are able to present information to a learner that includes all four of these modalities, these sensory modalities, we're actually able to give the brain more hooks to hang on to that information. We're employing more senses and we're doing it in an integrated way. That's what we mean by multisensory. And in our work at Learning for All, I would say that on this list, that's one of the biggest differentiators for learners who come to us who've had a lot of different reading programs and were not able to read using those. And after they've done therapy with an Orton Gilling program, that's multisensory. And the biggest differentiator is that we give them more their brain more sensory hooks to hang on to that information and retain it. So that multisensory component is really important. The program needs to be systematic. meaning that it needs to have a plan that builds upon itself. And this is one of the challenges with balanced literacy because you're employing a bunch of different programs. It can be very random and haphazard. And rather than having a clear structure set out to make it systematic, it can be very random. And so there are holes that develop in that approach. So it needs to be systematic. It needs to go according to a plan, and that plan needs to be based on what's developmentally appropriate for learners at different stages of their educational journey. So it needs to be systematic. And following on that closely is it needs to be sequential, meaning that one step builds on the next one. So there is a specific order for how we teach concepts, and that's what it means for it to be sequential. You can't just teach these things in any order. It needs to build upon itself. So before you teach words with complicated spelling patterns, like a word that has a silent E, we need to teach words that have short vowels. And before we teach words that have short vowels, we need to teach words that we need to teach sounds and how they connect to symbols. So there's a sequential process. It needs to be mastery based. And this is another thing that can be difficult in a classroom setting, but is so important when we're talking about reading and spelling. And what we mean by mastery based is that a learner masters one concept before we go on to the next concept and add new learning. So, our neurotypical learners who are strong readers and have a strong language skills can kind of often go at a quicker pace, maybe than a learner who has weaker language skills or some kind of processing disability like dyslexia. But and that's where the differentiation comes in the pacing of how the information is presented, because we need to achieve mastery before we go on and add new concepts. And finally, the instruction needs to be explicit, direct instruction. And the biggest example of this is understanding why some readers are not successful in at learning to read or spell in a classroom setting, even though they've had great instruction, great teachers, and even and their peers seem to be doing fine and getting all of these things, and some learners are not getting it. If we're talking about balanced literacy, another piece of that is the notion that the biggest element in learning is exposure. So the more exposure we can give learners to different kinds of language, the more they see it in different contexts or hear it or just simply are around it, they'll eventually just sort of pick that up by osmosis and learn to read and spell. And some learners do that, but learners who have any kind of language challenge at all will not be able to learn to read and spell effectively that way. So it's not just picking it up by exposure. Reading needs to be explicitly and intentionally taught, and spelling does as well. So when we're looking at programs that are effective, we need to look for programs that include all of these characteristics. And again, for our neurotypical readers, some of them will still do okay, even if some of these pieces are missing. But for learners that are struggling, every single one of these characteristics is essential to them becoming proficient readers. All right, so next I want to talk about the 5 pillars of reading. And these come from the science of reading. And some people think the science of reading is just about teaching phonics, but actually phonics is only one of the 5 pillars of reading. So I want to just do quickly, we're going to kind of touch on these. I have some slides, and we're not going to get to every piece on there, but I want to explain these 5 pillars so that you understand what they are. And then we're going to take these pillars and talk about things that you can do at home to support the development of these 5 pillars of reading. So first of all, and we're going to unpack each one, we have phonemic awareness, which has to do with the sounds of language, phonics, which has to do with the connection of the sounds to the symbols, Fluency, which has to do with the speed and accuracy of reading. Vocabulary, which has to do with understanding specific words. And comprehension, which is the synthesis of all of these things. And the goal of reading always is comprehension, but it comes at the very bottom of this stack of pillars. And so, in order to get to comprehension, effective comprehension, understanding what we can read and being able to apply that, that's comprehension, we have to go through these really important, essential foundational steps. So, let's talk about these steps now for a second. What do I mean when I say phonemic awareness? Phonemic awareness is the understanding of the sounds of language and how they work. And really, this level happens apart from the symbols. We want to be able to do all kinds of things just with the sounds alone. So, some of the things that we need to be able to do, we need to be able to remember a sequence of sounds. O, can I remember those? Can I repeat them? And then we need to be able to do different things with them. Can I say those in reverse? K, ol. Can I say all but the second, all but the middle sound? K, ol, right? So we're talking about manipulation, deletion, isolation. Can I say just the first sound? K, or just the last sound? Ol. Can I break apart something into its constituent sounds? So if the word is mat, can I break that into at? That's segmenting. Can I rhyme? What rhymes with mat? Cat, fat, sat, lat. Nonsense words, real words. All we're changing is the first consonant sound when we're rhyming. Can I take things that are separated and put them together to make a word? Mm, Sam. That's blending. So all of these things need to be able to be done without the symbols. That's phonemic awareness. And then we will get to the last one, which is connecting the sounds to the symbols. And that's where we move into phonics. So, phonics has several components. The first is the alphabetic principle. In phonemic awareness, we were just talking about sounds. Now we need to attach those sounds to a symbol. Remember that I said previously that spoken language is natural, but written language is something that humans have invented to be able to record spoken language and preserve it. And so this alphabetic principle is a way of applying a code to spoken language. We take a word like because and we apply letters to the sounds in the word because, and that becomes a written code. So sometimes we call that the process of taking a word like because and putting the letters to it is spelling, right? And we're applying the code. So we can also call that encoding. The process of looking at the word because on a piece of paper and translating that code into a spoken word is decoding. We're taking the code now and we're making it into a spoken word. So decoding and reading are the same thing, encoding and spelling. We're either applying the code or we're interpreting the code. And this uses the alphabetic principle. It maps phonemes to graphemes. So phonemes are units of sound and graphemes are letter combinations. We can get very complicated phoneme to grapheme combinations in the English language, where we might have one sound like A, and we might spell it with 4 letters, E-I-G-H, as in the word eight. And so that's mapping phonemes, the sounds, to graphemes, the letter combinations. We have syllabication, and this is the idea that words can have multiple syllables. They're like the heartbeats in a word that we can hear, and we can clap them. Bath, bathtub, fabrication, 4 syllables. So breaking words into syllables is part of phonics. And finally, this is where syllable types come into play, which is an essential component of spelling. We have 7 syllable types that we teach in the English language. And depending on what the syllable type is, oftentimes that has a direct impact on how you will spell that grapheme, or that phoneme rather, what grapheme you will use to spell it. So syllable types are important. All of these things are taught in the phonics stage. What you might notice here is we're teaching rules for language, and those rules are systematic and they build upon each other. When you teach rules rather than memorization, you have a process that's flexible. If we teach memorization, we pretty much have to teach every single word individually. And most of our memories cannot hold all of that. But if we're teaching rules and patterns, as we do in phonics, we're able to create a flexible system that allows our learners to learn a lot of words, how to read them, and how to spell them by learning a few patterns. Next pillar is fluency, and this is a synthesis of 3 things: speed, accuracy, and effort. So speed is pretty obvious, how fast we can read. If we read too slowly, we cannot make meaning of, right? Too slowly, what happens? We lose comprehension. Because we forget the beginning. By the time we got to the end, our brain, our working memory can't hold all that information. So speed is really important. We have to be able to read fast enough to hold everything in our working memory to make meaning out of it. Accuracy as a component is pretty obvious. If you're misreading words, obviously you're not going to have good comprehension because you've made errors. The last one is kind of tricky. This is effortfulness or difficulty. If reading is too hard for you to sustain your attention over time, then you're also not going to be an efficient reader. You might be fast enough and accurate enough for 1 or 2 minutes to sort of get through a few sentences well enough to understand. But if you can't sustain that effort because it took every ounce of your cognitive energy to do it, you don't have an efficient process for reading and you won't be able to comprehend longer passages with more complicated words. So fluency works on these things. We need, in order to have fluency, automaticity. It's an essential component of comprehension. If we have to think too hard about that decoding step, saying the right words, then we're not going to get to comprehension, which is the goal. So I'm not going to spend too much more time on this slide. There are several other components. One thing to note, however, if your learner is struggling with fluency, speed, accuracy, and effortfulness combined together, you definitely will want to do repeated readings of controlled text where you're also trying to preempt the errors. So looking for words that are going to be difficult, decoding those separately, and doing repeated readings of that passage. That's an essential component of building fluency. When you introduce new passages every time, then it's difficult for fluency to improve as a specific category. The next pillar that we're going to look at is vocabulary. Just a couple things I'm going to highlight on this slide. There are 3 different levels of vocabulary, but the most important thing to note here is that verbal comprehension precedes reading comprehension. Verbal comprehension has to come first. If a learner doesn't understand a word that's spoken to them, when it's spoken to them, they're not going to understand that word when they read it in print. And this is going to go to some of the recommendations that I'm going to have for working at home. But one of the best things that you can do for a learner at any age is read to them or listen to audiobooks that are above their reading level. Audiobooks or books with more challenging vocabulary than they can read, because it's going to flex this muscle. They're going to listen to be able to listen to new vocabulary, acquire new vocabulary by hearing it, and then they will be able to apply that to reading. So that's a really important aspect of vocabulary building that's so easy to do. You're sitting in the car listening to a great audiobook, that's at a higher level than your learner's reading level. At their intellectual level, a level they can understand, and hopefully something fun and engaging that they will also enjoy, because that is a big component of building vocabulary as well. Last of all, our final pillar I want to talk about is comprehension. And this is the goal. All of the other pillars exist to support this. Comprehension is a complex process. We can talk about the different elements of comprehension, but the main thing I want to point out on this slide are two things. First of all, that comprehension involves the ability to visualize information that is read. So sometimes we talk to our learners about creating a movie of what we're reading in their head. Can they create a movie of that? So if I'm reading my learner a story about a boy and he's out on a hill and he's flying a kite and it's a cold, windy day in the wintertime. I want my learner to be able to make a movie of that in his head. I want her to be able to picture what that looks like. So I might pause and ask her questions. What is the boy wearing? And this is where the next part comes in, the ability to create connections with information. If I've told my learner, if I've read to her describe that it's a cold, windy day in winter and this boy is out flying a kite, and I ask my learner what he's wearing, I'm hoping that she's going to tell me he's wearing a jacket or a sweater and a beanie and a scarf, right? Things that are appropriate to the scene that she's seeing. This is what we call inference. I haven't directly told her what he should be wearing, but the context of the story suggests those things. That's inference and a flexibility, the ability to create connections. So, when we're talking about reading, one aside here, most of these pillars that we've talked about so far have to do primarily with the process of decoding and its development toward comprehension. Um, but sometimes, and so a lot of times when learners come with reading challenges, when they come to Learning for All, for example, a lot of what we're looking at is fixing that decoding. When we fix the decoding, those pillars underneath, the comprehension often follows, because those learners typically have very good verbal comprehension as opposed to very poor reading comprehension. And it's the disconnect. One of the gold standard red flags of dyslexia is a disconnect between their verbal comprehension, what they understand if you read to them, versus their reading comprehension, what they understand if they read to themselves. And so that's a huge marker for dyslexia. But we do have learners sometimes that struggle with reading and they have no problem with decoding. They can read beautifully to you a passage, but they don't understand what it means. And that is a deficit in this pillar. And one of the ways, and we fix it in a different way than we fix the dyslexia one, it's typically a verbal perception or language deficit. And for that, we're going back to some of these pieces about creating connections, building vocabulary, being able to visualize language and make those connections effectively. So those are the 5 pillars. We're going to move on here and talk about some practical takeaways. What are some foundational exercises that you can do with your learners at different stages of their reading development? How can you support this evidence-based approach to learning to read? We want them obviously to have great reading instruction in school, but there are a lot of ways that parents can support that at home. First, we're going to talk about emergent readers, our kinder through second. These are students that are learning to read, and even um, right before kinder in pre-K, developing those pre-reading skills that are essential to when they start having formal instruction in reading. So what are some things we could do? We could play rhyming games. Pick a word like great and see how many words you can rhyme. Fate, mate, late, plate, state, right? Nonsense words, real words. Um, we can play rhyming games. We can think about sounds and we can not attaching them to symbols, but just listening. All of the sounds in English, in the alphabet, in the English language, are either quiet or noisy, and they're either long or quick. So our quiet sounds are sounds that are not vocalized, like okay, versus the vocalized version of that, which is the throat vibrates. You're engaging the vocal cords for z, but not for s. The same thing happens in your mouth, but one vibrates or one is noisy and one does not vibrate, one is quiet. So we can help our learners listen and try to identify those sounds. We can also think about what we call long and quick sounds. Long sounds are sounds that you can hold out indefinitely, like all of our vowels. Ah, as long as I have breath, I can hold out that ah sound. Quick sounds are sounds that cannot be held out at all, like the sound t. There's no way to hold that t longer. In fact, the error is if we're saying this sound as ta, that second sound is not t. So t is a quick sound. It has to go very quickly. When you understand those dynamics, it helps a lot with blending. And some learners that struggle with blending need to go back to this step and understand the difference between quiet and noisy sounds and long and quick sounds. Auditory phoneme manipulation. I kind of demonstrated that earlier in phonemic awareness, but we can give groups of sounds, lists of sounds, and have learners repeat them, delete a sound, add a sound, move the sounds around, try to remember them. That's that one. And then we want our learners to be able to identify just by listening and thinking words versus syllables versus sounds. And you'd be surprised at how many learners struggle with this when they have a reading disability. So if I give you a sentence, take me to the river, I want to know how many words are in there. Some in that sentence, some learners will combine words. So they'll think take me is a word, take me to the river, right? 4 words instead of 5, take me to the river. Or they'll parse out syllables and think of them as words, take me to the river, right? And so we want students to understand the difference between words and syllables or sounds. Syllable games are great. Counting the syllables in words, fabrication, 4 syllables versus bathtub versus cat. And then the difference between sounds, not thinking about spelling, but just the sounds that we hear. So, for example, in a word like river, how many syllables? River, we have 2. How many sounds in river? I, v, 4 sounds. But how many letters do we use to spell it? We use 5 letters. So these are all questions that you can start to play with, not the spelling as much at this age, but definitely thinking about how many sounds. And when we get to the next stage of reading, we can add the spelling component, which is really important. By the way, one thing you might have noticed is that when I'm talking about these things, I'm always talking about reading and spelling. And one of the myths that parents often hear is that, some kids are just spellers, some kids aren't. We don't really worry too much about spelling. Some people get it and some people don't. And that really is actually There are definitely people who have more challenges with spelling than others, but poor spelling is a huge red flag for difficulty with language development because we talked about decoding and encoding. They're kind of inverse operations, if you will, in reading. And if you can only go one way, like you can only go the reading direction, but you can't go the spelling direction, that's an indication that you really don't understand those foundational principles of how language works. And it also can be an indication that you have a poor visual memory, which can impact other areas as well. So spelling is important. We also can play nonsense word games. So this is another great exercise. Can we spell words like it's always hard to think of a word of a nonsense word when you're thinking of words. Slash. Can I spell that word? Right? Even though it's not a real word, can I break it into sounds and apply the appropriate symbols to it? So those are some really great foundational reading exercises for our emergent readers in K through 2. Next, let's look at some exercises for our developing readers in 3 to 5. By the time readers get to the end of third grade, most schools are not doing a lot of reading instruction and they're doing much more learning based on reading. So sometimes we call that shift a shift from learning to read to reading to learn. And so when learners are at the end of third grade, entering fourth grade, and they're still not proficient readers, this can be a really difficult time. And it's a time where a lot of students come to us at Learning for All because they start to see that they're still struggling, and now the expectation is that they'll be reading proficiently. So these are still, though, developing readers, and we're still wanting those reading skills to keep progressing. So what are some things we can do? Syllable division games. The more complicated, the better, to divide words into their syllables. How many sounds versus how many letters? I demonstrated that on the word river, and we can make those more complicated. Find the accent game. This is a great one for developing readers because it turns out that the accented syllable in an English word often really impacts the spelling of that syllable. And so being able to hear the accent is really important. Manipulation. The accented syllable is a syllable that gets more stress. It's the syllable you hold out longer. Manipulation. Um, so that accented syllable is something we can teach our learners to listen for. In the word river, river, it's the first syllable that's accented, the one that gets the stress. We can play the synonyms and antonyms game. Pick a word and how many synonyms can you think of that go with it, and how many antonyms can you think of? These are all games that we can just play orally in the car. How many meanings game? Take a word like clutch. Clutch can be a verb meaning to grab. Clutch can be a noun meaning a lady's purse or the part of your car that you have to push in to shift the gears if you're as old as I am. All right. So we can think about words that have multiple meanings and even multiple uh, parts of speech and talk about those and how many can we think of. Finally, I want to touch on oral reading fluency. A lot of times by the time our learners get to this stage of third to fifth grade and they're developing readers, they're no longer reading aloud. At least probably not at home. And sometimes for parents, it's really important just to take the temperature once in a while of your learner on how they're reading aloud, because if they're struggling with reading, you will hear evidence of that when they're reading aloud to you. That said, in the classroom, I don't recommend reading aloud in a full classroom for students as a way of the class getting information. When that's happening in the classroom setting, even proficient readers are usually way more focused on having to read in front of their peers and not making mistakes and all of those things than they are on comprehending the passage. So there are better ways to get information to learners than reading aloud in class. For the learners to be reading aloud in class, However, it is important that we do checks in on reading fluency so that we're looking for problems and identifying struggles there and challenges. All right, last of all, I just want to touch on a couple quickly here for our proficient readers, our middle school readers. A few things that we can do are play morphology games. A morpheme is the smallest unit of a word that has meaning. So if we take a word like anti-disestablishment, there's actually four morphemes in that word. Anti, which means opposite, dis, which means against, establish, which is the root word, which means to create, and ment, which is a suffix that makes a verb into a noun. Establish is a noun to establish, and when we add ment, establishment, it becomes a noun, a thing. It's the product of what you create. What you create is an establishment. So that's an example of how we would use morphology to think about the meanings of prefixes, suffixes, and roots and be able to separate words into those constituent parts. Another one of my favorite games to play with this age, and even the age before also works, is the dictionary game. This game assumes that somewhere in your house you do have a dusty paper dictionary that you can blow the dust off and open it to any letter. And you let your readers know, okay, we're working in J, and I'm just going to read you a definition and see if you can come up with a word. This is a J word. Ready? Here's the definition: to push, crowd, to bump into on purpose, the action or instance of bumping into someone. That word is jostle. Jostle is the word. All right. So this is a really fun game to play. And if your learners are smart, it also, and they think about alphabetizing, if you go down the list, they'll be thinking of JO words or JOS words if they know that you're staying on the same page. Um, we can do syntax or grammar games. One of my favorite ones to do here is Mad Libs. If you've never played this, it's really fun. You come up with words based on grammar types. So a noun, a plural noun, it'll ask for, or a verb ending in ing. And then those words will get inserted into the passage and they create funny stories. If I have a verb ending in ing, maybe I want to use the word I just used, which is jostling. And my sentence now is, have you always wondered what it's like to be a dog? 7 a.m. I wake up and my tummy is jostling. So fun way to get grammar and syntax practice in there and make people laugh. Sentence diagramming is another way, a way to visualize and chart grammar, which is a really great way for learners to understand it. So these are some foundational things that we can do. Some are really easy. They can be done at home. You can do them in the car. These are all ways to support your learner for reading and spelling. Last thing I want to cover, and we're not going to go through all of these, but I just wanted to share a few slides. When should we be concerned as parents if our learner is struggling with reading? These are some red flags that we often see in learners with dyslexia. Dyslexia is a specific learning disability in reading. The thing about dyslexia is that it's actually a different brain organization. Dyslexia has some superpowers, but it makes reading and spelling really difficult. And so if your learner has dyslexia, and dyslexia is hereditary, a hereditary condition, they're going to need a very specific and targeted way to learn to read. So they're going to need all the things that we just talked about on steroids. They're going to need it to be very explicit, very direct. They might need it one-on-one, and they're going to need a lot of support around that. So here are some warning signs you might see in learners who have a specific learning disability in reading. In the early years, delayed speech, mixing up sounds and symbols in longer words, chronic ear infections, age 1 to 5 is when we're developing that auditory processing piece of our brain, and chronic ear infections can really impact the development of our auditory processing skills. Poor auditory processing is very much related to dyslexia, a component of dyslexia. Constant confusion with left versus right, directionality, late to establish a dominant hand. So that ambidextrous, especially continuing past the normal stage of development where that usually resolves. Difficulty learning to tie shoes, memorizing the alphabet, phone number, address, really memorizing anything that's a sequence of numbers or letters or disconnected material. Difficulty with rhyming, those exercises earlier, if your learner's struggling with that, they don't naturally hear how to rhyme, that's a big red flag. And family history. If we're looking at the elementary years, here are a few other things that you might want to be looking for. Slow, choppy, or inaccurate reading. That's where that oral reading fluency comes in. Guessing at words based on shape and context. Some reading programs actually encourage learners to guess, and it's a very poor method because they're not actually decoding using the rules of language. But if you see your learner is guessing, maybe they're looking at the picture. So the sentence says the boy jumped into the pond, and the child reads the boy jumped into the lake, right? Lake and pond are not related, but the pictures, it's a synonym. So that kind of guessing is a huge red flag. They're not actually reading those words. Skipping or missing prepositions, ignoring suffixes. Usually beginnings of words are good, but the ends of words often get missed or confused. Slow, non-automatic handwriting that's difficult to read, also associated with dysgraphia. Reversals past the end of first grade. It's a huge myth that dyslexia is about seeing letters backwards or doing reversals. That can be a component, but it's only one red flag of many. Difficulty with cursive, avoids reading aloud, can't sound out unknown words, terrible spelling, can't remember sight words for reading or spelling, mixes up homonyms, difficulty telling time on an analog clock. A few more for this stage. Difficulty memorizing multiplication facts, difficulty with sequences of steps, anything that has multiple steps, difficulty with directionality, difficulty when speaking, finding the right word. It's the thingamajig, right? We call that rapid naming, that ability to quickly and efficiently pull language. Common words or phrases come out slightly twisted. Peschetti for spaghetti, cinnamon for cinnamon. Extremely messy bedroom or backpack, dreads going to school, anxiety, complaining of stomach aches, going to the nurse's office frequently at school can be a symptom of anxiety related to learning challenges. Resistance to language tasks, may have nightmares about school. Leaving out spaces, capitals, punctuation, what we call orthography, and difficulty with timed tests. So all of these are red flags. A lot of learners have several of these sort of scattered across these different symptoms. And a few of these are not alarming, but if you're going down this list and you're checking off, over half of these symptoms that you see in your learner, it's a good idea to get a follow-up to find out if there is something going on with their language development and processing. All right. I just wanted to share this slide quickly with resources. You could take a quick screenshot if you want. These are some great websites that you can go to learn more about the science of reading and about dyslexia. Also, some books that explain a lot of these principles that are foundational to efficient reading. And finally, I want to open it up for question and answer. Thank you all for your attention. Erin, do we have any questions?
Don't have any questions that you haven't addressed. There were a couple in regards to reading, like able to decode, but then really just doesn't understand anything that they're reading. So kind of knowing, you think of dyslexia as not being able to actually like read the words or that, but there is that connection between like the comprehension piece.
Yeah, and that's let me just expand on that a little, Erin, because that's a really important question. And it's the reason that some learners with dyslexia don't get appropriate intervention because sometimes they're decoding even if they're doing an oral reading fluency, and especially if they're bright and they're young, they kind of get by on the decoding. They can kind of pass, through. They're not doing really great at decoding, but they're not in that egregiously low, flagging. We're worried about the student level. But the component that often gets missed, especially right around that second, third, fourth grade level for bright kids, is how effortful it is for them, how much mental energy is required to do the decoding. And usually then it's also slower. So when we talked about the three components of fluency being speed, accuracy, and effortfulness, um, they might be accurate, but if they're too slow, they're not going to comprehend. And if it's too hard, they can't maintain it, or it just takes everything they can do to decode. They're not thinking about what those words mean. And so they must become more automatic at the decoding. It must become quicker, and they have to not have to concentrate on the decoding so much in order to get to comprehension. And so just because, a learner gets 100% on a 1 minute oral reading fluency, they don't make any errors, or maybe they only make one or two, and they kind of just squeak in under the speed barrier. A lot of times at Learning for All, we'll have that learner not stop at 1 minute, but actually read for 3 minutes. And when it is very effortful for them, when all their energy is going into decoding and not in comprehension, then after that first minute, we typically see the scores just kind of go off a cliff. And so that second minute, the scores will be worse. And a lot of times by the time we get to the third minute, that learner's skipping lines or making errors. And so we see the accumulated fatigue coming out in the reading performance.
I think goes into one of the other points of understanding that effortfulness that connects to the feeling of they're just not trying, or they don't care, or that, and then that ties to a little of the executive functioning piece, but figuring out kind of where that breakdown is and why maybe they're not trying, or they're not focusing, they're not paying attention, is so important for a lot of our learners at these earlier stages, where they're really able to kind of fake it or get by for a while, but then especially in that middle elementary, it can start to come out where maybe it looks like some of those masking or deflecting and not paying attention.
It's so important for parents to understand that, as except for a minute um portion of the population that actually has a mental illness around not wanting, defiance or non-compliance, almost universally every child wants to be successful in the classroom. They start out wanting that. They start out wanting to do well. But when they fail or they struggle, a lot of times that's where we see it come out as behaviors. And it's not that they don't want to do well or that they're lazy or that they don't care, but if they don't have a strategy to be successful, if they can't read and nobody's giving them a strategy to improve that, then they don't have a lot of choices. And so that will come out as, being distracting the classroom, being the class clown, looking at something else, you're not paying attention. How come you come home and you won't do your homework? Well, they're exhausted because they spent the whole day, just trying to kind of get by and attend. And so that's why it's really important. Sometimes we see it in behaviors. And so but we want to unpack that and see if there's something else underneath that behavior that's driving that behavior. And that until we address that, if it's a reading deficit, we're going to continue to see struggles with the behavior. And as learners get older, a lot of times that can devolve into mental health issues that are related as well.
I think that's where the parent teacher conferences and the check-ins throughout the year, if there are start to be more behaviors, it is that figuring out kind of what else is going on, or um potentially you can always reach out and figure out, where um can we get the right support to be able to make them feel confident in the classroom too, because that's a big part as well as that confidence.